Hi, everyone. Welcome to clinical training for CPST and PSR and anyone else who's interested, providers. I'm going to record these trainings in probably 2 or 3 segments. Number one, because this platform limits me to 15 minutes, and number two, because you probably don't want to hear me talking for more than 15 minutes at a time. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so number one, you want to think of the work that you're doing with the children in somewhat broad terms. Okay, so you're going to be spending, a fair amount of time with these kids. So, we don't want to get too bogged down in the treatment goals per se, or really specifics. It's hard to spend that much time with a child, with a very rigid agenda, right? So think about, the work you're doing. Think about the help that you're giving in a somewhat broad way, just being with this child, spending time with the child, getting into their world, interacting with them. It's all helpful. So think of it broadly, but of course not too broadly, right? You're not just there. You're not just there, to just to play, right, or just to be with the child. So it's a bit of an art, okay? So as I said, it's an art, not a science. Making this balance between thinking broadly but not too broadly. It's an art. You'll figure it out, right? We'll all figure it out together. Okay, so again, sessions should address the treatment goals, but don't be so concerned about that it gets in the way, right? If the treatment goals are if concern about the treatment goals is getting in the way of just you interacting with this child, then probably that's a sign that you're being a little bit too rigid and too specific in that. But in some sense, they do need to address the treatment goals. And I'm sorry, that's a little vague, but such is the work. Okay, so as I said, you can't spend 2 or more hours, with a child addressing treatment goals. I mean, that's just not realistic. Okay, so again, we're here to help, right? We're just here to help. So we want to define this broadly, but not go off the rails, right? It's not, help doesn't mean you can do anything you want, but it also doesn't mean that you have to be too rigid with the treatment goals. Okay, you want to work on listening carefully for opportunities to address the treatment goals. Okay, so those opportunities are going to arise, but you have to listen for them, right? They're not gonna be obvious. So you want to get good at listening for opportunities to address the treatment goals, and we'll talk more about that. Okay, try to let those opportunities arise organically. Don't force it. If one of the goals, for example, has to do with social skills, so you're interacting with this child, right? So this is your interaction with the child is an opportunity to address social skills. You don't have to ask them specifically, about, an interaction with someone else, per se. If you're, maybe one of the issues has to do with being safe in the community and not doing risky behavior. So when you're outside with this child, there may be opportunities to just sort of talk about or think about what they're observing in their environment. Again, these are opportunities that are around you, right? But you don't have to sort of force the issue and create these opportunities. It's better to just look out for them and have them come by themselves. I'll also be sending you a list of suggestions for things that you can do in various environments. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about engagement. Okay, so engagement is the first step in any kind of treatment process. Okay, obviously, as we understand, there's a treatment process. There's meant to be treatment. It's meant to be helpful. It's meant that in the beginning there was a problem, and by the end of treatment, it's somewhat better, right? That there's a solution-focused, goal-oriented orientation to the program. We're not just here, just to spend time with each other. That said, the process, right? The process of treatment is a process. And the first step in that process is engagement. And that's okay. It doesn't mean you're not doing anything, right? If you're just focused on engagement in the beginning, that doesn't mean that you're not involved in the process. You may not yet be up to the treatment goals, but that doesn't mean you're not involved in the process, because the process involves engagement. So in the beginning, focus on engagement. Okay. And of course, it's going to be different for every child. Some kids are going to engage very quickly, and others it's going to take time. So it's okay, to focus on that in the beginning. Of course, you don't want that to go on forever, right? Eventually you do want to shift the focus to the treatment goals, but don't be in a hurried rush to do that. If engagement is going to take some time with this child, that's perfectly fine. Okay. Okay, so, I'm not going to tell you how to engage children. I think we all have a sense of how to do that. Maybe that could be a separate instruction if you're interested. But, I think we all have, a pretty decent sense of how to engage children. And, you all have your own unique way of doing that, which is great. But just a couple of thoughts. Number one is to enter their world, right? They have a world unto themselves, things that they're interested in, things that they do. And we want to really be curious and open to entering their world genuinely, right? Not, again, not because we want to use that, but just really, genuinely we're interested in their world. Okay, so we want to be curious and open to what they like and what they do, and let's do it together. If they're watching, some videos that they really do it for them, do it with them. If they're whatever into social media and, something in particular has got their attention, then do it. If they're into video games, then do video games with them. I mean, I don't know if you want to play with them, maybe, but at least, watch them, let them show you, how they do it, video games. Okay. So this is, again, these aren't things that are other than the work. This is part of the work. These are the steps of engagement. And in the beginning, again, in the engagement phase, don't worry about the agenda, right? Don't worry about the treatment goals. Just get to know them. Okay, so let's talk about some overarching clinical ideas. Okay, so number one, try not to lecture. Okay, that's a hard one, I know. And there are plenty of reasons for that. Number one, they've heard it before, right? I always tell clinicians that when a person has a problem and there's an obvious solution to the problem, the more obvious the solution is, the less you should actually tell them that solution. And why is that? So the idea here is that if there's an obvious solution to their problem, they've heard it, right? Someone in their life has told, unless they're, living in a cave, or, it's possible they haven't heard it, but it's very unlikely, right? Somebody, if the answer to their problem is obvious, someone's already told it to them. Okay, so now let's follow this logic, right? If they've heard the answer, but they're not doing it, so then that raises an important question, right? There's something getting in between them and the obvious answer, right? There's some barrier, there's something going on, some reason that they're not doing the obvious answer. Now, we have no idea what that is, but that's the key, right? We need to know what that is, right? We need to know what's getting between them and the obvious answer. If we just give them the obvious answer, if we just tell them the obvious answer, either they're going to oppose us, or more likely, they're going to yes us. They're going to say, yeah, I know. Yeah, you're right. That's what everyone tells me. Yeah. And then they're not going to do it, right? Because we haven't discovered what it is that's getting in the way of them doing the obvious answer. I will say, by the way, that a good way to raise the obvious answer, right? If you want to sort of talk about the obvious answer without, telling them to do it, a good technique to do that is to ask what other people have said, right? What have your parents said about that? Oh, they said I should so and so. Okay, well, what do you think about that? Okay, and then you're going to hear what's getting in the way of the obvious answer. So yeah, the temptation, especially with children, right, is to kind of lecture them, to tell them to do it differently. Um, but they've probably heard it before. And so just telling them again probably isn't going to be so useful. In general, we don't want to discipline. Now, that's not, I'm not suggesting, that you should let kids walk all over you by any means. But we want to keep it to a minimum, right? We definitely have to discipline, set limits in ways that make sense for us and for the child. But that's not really the focus of what we do, right? That's more sort of along the lines of a teacher or maybe a parent. But our job, right? We're supposed to be kind of the more open, kind of anything, not anything goes, but like most things go with us, right? We want it to be a sort of open environment where it's okay to, most things are okay. So we want to keep it to a minimum. Okay, so whatever your boundaries are, and you're allowed to have whatever boundaries you want, whether that's your stuff or your body or where you're willing to go with them or whatever it is, like that's fine. You're allowed to have your own boundaries. You'll do this, but you won't do that. That's fine. But we want to try to be clear about that, because then other things should be okay. So anything other than safety, right? Obviously, you have to, be concerned about safety and your own boundaries. Other than that, right, it should be more of a permissive environment, right? That things are generally allowed. And if you find yourself disciplining, because it happens, right? We slip into it. It's normal, right? It's okay. But if you find yourself kind of in that space, like try to make a shift. Try to move away from that space of disciplining. You want to ask yourself, is the limit that I'm setting really necessary? I would say, for example, maybe if a child says something that's kind of offensive, maybe they use foul language. Now, again, it could be you have a personal boundary around that, and that may be, reasonable. But, maybe they just say something that's not nice and again, our tendency might be, well, you shouldn't talk like that, or, that's not nice, don't speak that way. But again, in a kind of therapeutic environment, we don't want to shut that down, right? Because that's, that's some real emotion that they're expressing, and we don't want them to sort of get the message that they have to, be careful around us. We want them to be open around us. So if you find yourself disciplining, ask yourself, like, is this really necessary? Is it really necessary to, to put a stop to this or to limit this? It might be, right? But it might not be. Hi, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of the clinical training. So let's get right to it. Okay, we are continuing with some basic clinical values in treating children in the program. Okay, so here we want to always pay attention to and reflect on how they interact with us. Many of the children we're going to be seeing, right, have social or communication issues, and so you're going to be seeing those symptoms in real time in the way that they interact with you. So rather than sort of artificially try to create some environment or situation where you can address these issues, why not use your actual interactions with them? Okay, so you always want to pay attention to and think about the process of how they're interacting with you, and then use that as part of the treatment process. So one popular method I suggest is to teach social skills by adopting the role of a peer. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that I'll give you an example. So in my career, I've played many games with kids, and something that can happen from time to time is that kids will cheat. They'll decide to start cheating during the middle of the game. So the question is, how do you respond to that, right? So the way that I respond to it is I kind of adopt the role of a peer, kind of go out of my therapist role. I adopt the role of a peer, and I say something like, "It looks like we're changing the rules in the middle of the game, and I don't want to play if we're going to do that. It's just not fun. I don't like that." And then usually the kid will say, "Oh, come on," and I'll say, "No, it's just not fun. I don't want to play if we're going to do that." Now, why do I do that? A few reasons. Number one, if I'm going to criticize their behavior, right? If as an adult I'm going to say, it's not nice to cheat, right? You shouldn't cheat. Cheating's bad. They're probably just going to oppose me, and it's not going to be very effective. More importantly, when it comes to social interactions, so social communication usually happens non-verbally, right? You do something in speaking to another person or interacting with another person, and their response to what you did is usually nonverbal. They're not usually going to tell you what they're thinking or feeling. They're usually going to do something. So, for example, if you do something that's obnoxious to another person, they're going to go away, right? They're going to find some way to leave your presence. They're not usually going to tell you, I don't like what you just said. And certainly that's true of children, right? It's all the more so for children. Children are not going to verbalize how they feel about what this other child did. They're just going to vote with their feet, or they're going to do something. Now, again, a healthy child is able to understand that social learning. They're able to understand that, okay, I just did something or said something, and this kid went away. I guess that means maybe I should think about what I did. But plenty of children have struggled with that. They're not learning those social cues, and especially the kids that we're going to see, probably many of them have that kind of deficit. So what you're going to do is you're going to actually verbalize it. You're going to verbalize what other kids are thinking, right? But they're not verbalizing. They're not going to tell them. So as you verbalize it, you're giving them important social information that they're not picking up on. So when I say, I don't want to play if we cheat, right? I'm saying what other kids are thinking, but other kids aren't going to say that. They're just going to go away. So it's very important, right, that you speak that out. And again, when you speak it in the role of a peer, it's just more effective. You're not getting them defensive because you're not criticizing them. You're not saying, you shouldn't cheat. You're saying, if you cheat, I don't want to play with you. Okay, that's not a criticism. That's just kind of a reality. And it's an important reality that they need to hear. Okay, so at various times, I would have that in your back pocket to think about responding to something they did or said as if you're kind of their friend, not as if you're the therapist. So it might be something like saying something like, "Gee, that felt really bossy the way you said that. It makes me not want to it makes me not want to do what you said because it just feels really bossy." Okay, so something along those lines. Okay, so here I wrote that example, right? I really want to hear what you want to. I really want to hear what you want to do, but when you speak to me in a bossy way, it makes me not want to play with you. Okay, don't try not to say it as a criticizing adult. You're being bossy. Is there a different way you could say that? Okay, so that's something that an adult would say, but that's a criticism, and I think it's less effective. Okay, and as I said, kids need to hear the social consequences of their behavior. Others aren't going to tell them. Their peers aren't going to tell them. So it's good for us to tell them. Okay, we want to reflect their struggles in this area. It seems like you want me to do something or understand something, but you're having a hard time saying it or having a hard time expressing it. Okay, but whatever it is, again, use your interactions with the child as a laboratory to work on these issues. Okay, pretend play, obviously, right? A great skill to use, a great activity to engage in. When you're engaged in pretend play, try to do the work, right? Try to do the treatment with the characters. Okay, so an example might be, it seems like, this character is really angry right now. What do you think that's like for him? Where does he feel it in his body? What can he do to cope with these feelings? Could he talk to someone about it? Do you think that'll help if he expresses how he's like? Whatever you're going to do it with the character, not with the client, right? Not with the child, but do it with the character. And important, don't bring it back to the child, right? Don't say, okay, now let's apply that to you, right? Now let's talk about you. Don't do that. Number one, it's not necessary, right? Kids get it. They're going to do the learning that you want them to do without bringing it back to them, right? Because when it comes to sort of fantasy, that's a kid's natural space, right? They don't see it as distinct from reality, right? Pretend is part of their world, right? So when they're thinking about a character, they're thinking about it deeply, and they're going to do the learning. And then number two, if you try to bring it back to them, you might lose them. They might get defensive. Children have weak egos. I mean, that's just, that's normal. For someone to really face themselves, it takes a lot of strength, right? It takes a lot of ego strength. And most kids don't have that, which is fine, right? It's not a criticism. That's just developmentally normal. So if you really try to get them to face themselves, it's pretty hard. So if they're thinking deeply about the character, if they're, problem solving, if they're doing this work with the character, leave it alone. That's golden. You've already done a tremendous amount if you can do that. Okay, praise and validation. Okay, so we want to avoid labels. We want to praise behavior, not the person. Okay, so we want to move from "you're very smart" to "that was very smart of you," right? So I'm emphasizing the behavior, not the person. Now, why is that? So there are plenty of studies, right, over the years that show that labels, including positive ones, are harmful. I'll give you just a quick example. Studied many, many years ago. They took two groups of kids. They gave them math problems. So they separated them into two groups. One group, they said to them, you did really well. You must be very smart. You're very smart. And the other, they said, you did very well. You must have really worked hard at that. You must have really thought about that. And then they gave them a second test. And the kids who they said you're very smart did worse than the kids who they said you must have worked hard. Okay? Little counterintuitive. So, the idea here is that when you are something, it's like a box, right? You are defined by that thing. I am this. And so that's like a kind of prison, right? You have to be that thing, right? You can't be anything. You are that thing. And so that becomes a burden that you have to live up to, that thing that you are. Now it's a little hard to relate to, because as adults, when people say to us, you are something, oh, you're so lazy. So we don't really think of that as, we don't define ourselves just because someone said you're lazy. But children do. When adults tell them you are something, children hear that and say, well, I'm trying to understand who I am. My parents just said, or these adults said, I am this. So I guess that's who I am, right? That's what I am. You are lazy. Okay, then I guess I'm lazy. You are smart. Okay, I have to be smart, right? That's who I have to be. And what if you're not? Then it's going to raise a lot of anxiety, right? If I am smart, but I do badly on a test, now I'm not being who I am. And that's scary. That's disturbing. I'll give you another example. Probably many of you are too young to remember, but there was a company called Enron in the late 90s, huge corporate conglomerate that just one day went completely bankrupt. Really crazy thing. And one of the things that they found is that they only hired the best of the best of the Ivy Leagues, smartest, top of the classes. And these are people who, were always told that they're smart. And so when they failed, right, when they started in their divisions, when their divisions started to struggle and started to fail, they were lying. They were saying, no, everything's fine. Everything's great. And they were lying. Now, Why were they doing that? Because failing wasn't who they are. They are smart, right? They are, the best of the best. So it was a threat to their very self-identity to fail. Like failing wasn't an option. So that's not good, right? You don't want to be defined by anything. You want to be open. You want your kids to be whoever they want to be, right? So any label is a problem. So when we're praising and validating, just be careful. We don't want to give them labels, even if they're positive ones. And we want to praise and validate the behavior, not define them with a label. Okay, we want to actively look for opportunities to praise and validate, right? Children tend to minimize their success. They don't see their successes, or they minimize them. They think it's no big deal. So we have to go out of our way, right, to look to recognize them and to raise their awareness of those successes. We want to explore how they succeeded, right? Children tend to think passively, which is normal. They tend to think of life as just kind of happening to them. So if you ask them, wow, you did really well in tests, how did you do that? They're probably going to say, I don't know, because that's how they relate to everything. Like, I don't know, it just happened, right? So we want to break it down. We want to say, well, let's talk about it. Let's talk about, how you think that happened. Did you study? Yeah. Okay. So that seems like maybe that was the reason that, that you did well on the test. So we want to try to break it down and give them a knowledge of why and how they succeeded. And the reason we want to do that is that if you don't know how it happened, right, if it was just something that happened to you, you can't replicate it. You can't do it again, right? But if you know how you did it, then you can. I like sports, so I'll give a sports analogy. If an athlete is on a hot streak, right, they just can't miss. They're total hot streak. If they have no idea how it happened, right, they're just on a hot streak. So it's going to end at some point, and they have no idea how to get it back. But if the reason that they're doing well is that they did something, right, they trained differently, they focus on a particular skill, if they know why they're doing better, then they can keep doing better, right? There's more hope that they'll be able to keep doing that, right? They don't have to just hope for a hot streak. So the same thing with kids. We want them to understand their success, not just passively relate to it. Hi, everyone. Welcome to part 3 of the clinical training. Okay, let's proceed. Okay, so one of the things that we can do for children is to challenge rigid thinking. So we know that children naturally think rigidly. It's developmentally appropriate. And moving children towards more flexible, right, less rigid thinking, but more flexible thinking, it's really one of the greatest gifts we can give them. When we're able to do this, we can often see a shift. We can see them kind of looking up, as if they're thinking about what we said. And it's really an amazing thing when we can do that for children. So some examples, right, might be, a child might say, I know I'm going to fail, right? So I might say, so I get that you're feeling really discouraged and not feeling very confident, but I guess I'm wondering how you know you're going to fail, right? So I'm challenging the rigidity of the I know I'm going to fail. I'm not, addressing the negative thinking per se, but I'm just challenging the rigidity of it, right? The I know. And I'm not saying, you shouldn't be negative, you should think positively, right? I'm challenging the rigid thinking of I know I'm going to fail, right? Because of course, obviously he doesn't know he's going to fail. Right? Another example might be, a child might say, all people or teachers or adults are like that. So I might say, I've met a lot of people in my life, and it seems to me that every person I've met is different. Okay, so again, I'm challenging the rigidity of the all, right? I'm not criticizing or I'm not, going against the negativity that they're saying per se, but I'm challenging the rigidity of all people. I'm trying to sort of, break that rigidity. Okay, and again, when you do that, it's an amazing gift that you can give children, And so look for opportunities, to do that. Okay, so I think the last point here is to sort of raise this question of who are we serving? Okay, so what do I mean here? So when children are in distress, when any other human being is in distress, it puts us in distress, and that's a good thing, right? That means that we care. So that's good. So when children are in distress, it puts us in a state of distress. So the problem here is that we want to make sure that we're not acting in response to our distress, right? So you're in distress, now I'm in distress. So I want to make sure that what I'm doing is not arising out of my desire to relieve my own distress. Now you might ask, well, so what? I mean, what difference does it make, right? If I'm helping this other person, then I'm helping both of us, right? I'm helping him, I'm helping the other person, I'm helping me at the same time. So what's wrong with that? So the answer is that if you're responding to your own distress, then you're not listening to the other person, right? You're not really in tune with the other person and their needs, right? Because you're responding to what's going on inside of you, and so you can really miss what the other person needs. So before I do that, I'll just tell a quick story. Some of you may have heard me say this story before, but I'll just tell you a quick story, a personal story that illustrates the point. So many years ago, one of my boys, it was Hanukkah time, and it was when drones were new, and it was kind of a fun toy to get a drone for your kid. So my son said he wanted a drone for Hanukkah. So we ordered him a drone, on Amazon, and he was excited. He was looking forward to getting this thing on Hanukkah, and so it came, and Hanukkah came, and he opened it up, and it's a piece of junk. It doesn't work. So he's very disappointed. I was in a different room when all this happened, but I overheard it. So I leave the room that I'm in. I go into the kitchen where he is, and I see he's got this, look of disappointment on his face. And, it's heartbreaking, right, as a parent, to see that. And when I saw it, I had this very, very strong desire, very strong desire to say, we'll get you a new one, right? I really wanted to say that, to make it better. And I said, stop. I said to myself, very quickly, I said, stop. Who are you serving here? Who are you trying to make feel better? I know that if I say we'll get you a new one, I know that I'm going to feel better. But is he going to feel better? Is it really going to help him right now? I mean, maybe it'll help him tomorrow. But right now, it's not going to help him. He's disappointed, right? He was looking forward to this. There is no way to fix this. And he's disappointed. And telling him we'll get you a new one doesn't really help his disappointment right now. So once I asked myself that question, who are you serving? I realized it's myself. I'm serving myself by saying that. So then I said, okay, I'm not going to say that. So then what am I going to do? Well, the answer is obvious, right? I'm going to give him empathy. And so that's what I did. I said, kiddo, I'm really sorry. I know you're really looking forward to that. And, it's really disappointing, that it didn't work. That's really a bummer. I'm really sorry. And it worked like a charm. He felt his mood changed instantly. Somebody understood. Somebody got how he was feeling. Okay, so it's just the point is, right, that when you have a desire to try to do something to make it better, you want to stop and ask yourself, who am I serving here? And if it's yourself, maybe rethink that. Okay, so signs that you're responding to your distress as opposed to the child's, if you're trying to make it better, right? And a lot of times you can't, right? Most of the time you can't really make it better. If you're lecturing the child, the child might say something like, I beat up some kid today. And you say, well, you really shouldn't do that. Or, is there another way you could have thought that you could do that? Maybe you could have told the teacher. Like, if you're doing that, it's probably because it's disturbing to you, right? That this child beat somebody up. And so you're trying to handle your own distress over that. Okay, and then just the last, point here is that being able to tolerate other people's distress is just a really important skill. It's a great skill to have in life. as a provider. It doesn't mean you don't care. I mean, God forbid, it doesn't mean that you don't care, about other people's distress. It means that you can tolerate it, that you can handle it, that it doesn't send you into a state of dysregulation, but that you're able to tolerate other people being in distress. And then if you're able to tolerate it, you're really able to be present for them, to be able to help them in that state of distress. Whereas if you go into distress, you're no longer available to help them. Okay. All right. So that about wraps it up. Thank you all for listening. I hope it was helpful, and good luck out there.